Day 262 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, I'll start off with the Russian military losses there, so go over to that slide and... whoop, that's the wrong one. Go over to the real slide there, and we'll start off with the Russian military personnel losses. So, as of the 12th of November 2022, a bit of a milestone in terms of approximate losses, so over 80,000, that mark there now. And in the last 24 hours, we're looking at an additional 810 Russian military personnel losses there. Then moving across to the hardware losses, quite a big day indeed, as you might expect, due to all of the recent events. So, armored combat vehicles, 34 losses, tanks 24, artillery 12 Russian losses. There's even one chopper here that's just squeezed in the last hour or two, and I'll show you all about that in a moment as well. And before we go back to the map, I'll just quickly show you again my homegrown hobby of captured Russian hardware in working order. Again, I had to build this chart from scratch since it doesn't actually exist anywhere else online in this format. Do note though, these figures are extremely fluid right now due to the hundreds of recently liberated settlements in Kherson. So we'll move back across to the map now, and as you might expect, today we'll start out in Kherson again, where the Ukrainian MOD, so the Ministry of Defense, has now officially confirmed that Ukraine has successfully liberated the entire north bank of the Dnipro River, as indicated here in blue. So yesterday there was some pockets of unconfirmed territory in grey, but those areas have now since all been squashed out. And all in all, Ukraine has now liberated 1,200 square miles, or about 3,000 square kilometers, in Kherson in this month of November. And again, due to all this liberating going on here, there is no shortage of what I might call liberation videos with cheering, tears of joy, flags raised, bonfires and holding hands at those bonfires, and many people walking outside of their homes, reportedly for the first time in weeks or months because of the previous Russian occupation in these areas. So tell me yourself, do these people look oppressed or liberated to you? And even after Russia's final parting gift of taking out the hydroelectric power dam infrastructure, causing the locals to not have any stable power for the next 30 days or so, you can still just see how these locals would rather live with backup generator power than instead live under the tyranny of an oppressive Russian regime. Or what the Pope on his Twitter page decided to instead identify it as some mercenaries making war. Excuse the laughter here. It's just that I would think that part of the Pope's duty would be to call out perceived evils, at least as he sees it, instead of taking a more, shall we say, diplomatic approach to his war, not actually calling out Russia here. Now, regarding some happenings of the Russian forces on the occupied south side only here now, so it has been reported that the Russian flag has been taken down from a Russian enlistment office in Novokakhovka. Now that is hard for me to believe at this point, although I did see a couple of separate sources that seem to indicate the same as well, which is also somewhat consistent with the news that Russia is building defensive lines at northern Crimea now, so up around this region there, which means Russia doesn't have a lot of faith in its army holding Kherson positions. Oh, and that reminds me, since the Ukrainian armed forces are pushing forward all the way along to the Dnipro River now, just north of it, this is starting to affect what Russia does, because Russia is now starting to evacuate its helicopter base at Chaplinka. So that is right there, you can see it, so another airfield. Due to the very fact that this helicopter fleet is now in range of HIMARS missiles, which is about 55 miles or approximately 90 kilometers. There we go. So I'll use the ruler, even go further. That's only 72 kilometers or about 40 miles there, for instance. So well within the range. Now, regarding the map here where the new lines are drawn, Ukraine on the north of the river, Russia on the south, it actually turns out Ukraine has the physical high ground advantage. And if Russia's recent massive losses in Pavlivka in the Donbass last week is any indication of their capability to execute an offensive maneuver from the low ground, well then they probably won't perform too great here either. So, moving on, regarding Ukraine's upcoming strategy here, well, one thing I want to say is that the Ukrainian armed forces that have been liberating Kherson can now be instead transferred to reinforce Ukrainian counter-offensives elsewhere, because it's unlikely that Russia is going to have a counter-offensive jumping across the river that they've just run away from in the past 48 hours or so. But back to this region in particular, if or when the Ukrainian forces break through Russian defensive lines, or pretty much horizontally below the river there, or parallel to it, I should say. So breaking those defensive Russian lines could indeed be yet another Ukrainian free-for-all, allowing Ukraine to take huge swaths of additional land on the south of the river, just like they did back in September at the location of Kharkiv to the north. So up there, naturally, all that green. Now, moving on to some of the captured Russian hardware in this region. Although it will be hard to get a completely accurate account of captured hardware so soon due to the speed at which the liberation of the Kherson settlements is occurring at around here, here is still some of the captures that we can account for so far. Oh, and not the least of which is this captured Russian Mi-8 chopper in working condition. Millions of dollars worth of Soviet-era helicopter right there, which the Ukrainian forces are already trained on and will certainly put to good use. Also, I've got this photo here of what appears to be a BMP-1. So that's an infantry fighting vehicle. It doesn't exactly have a tank turret or gun, but it's got a little machine gun style thing on the top. But yeah, just an infantry fighting vehicle. Very old Soviet-era one, but still, again, can be put to good use by the Ukrainian forces. Oh, and very freshly reported, the Russian army abandoned at least one S-300 air defense system in the Kherson region during the retreat as well, so that's always fantastic to see. Ukraine picking up air defense systems from Russia. And now I'll move on to, well, there's also a couple of scrap pieces Russia left behind that I'd like to mention quickly here. So first is 2 Russian tanks that the Russian forces instead sabotaged upon retreat to the south bank of the river, blowing these 2 up. And it sucks when you are losing so badly that you have to blow up your own tanks. And speaking of scrap metal that's left over, or left behind, this is an example of a left behind Russian 1960s van, often referred to as a Scooby-Doo orc van. These of which have been well reported to be used very frequently by Russian forces on the front line due to a lack of available Russian armored personnel vehicles, or any other various armored infantry vehicles for that matter. And it's been well reported now that Russian forces, or Russian troops, absolutely hate these things so much, as they offer no armor, no protection. So the Russian troops themselves often refer to these as tin cans, and you can see exactly why in photos like these too. Then we'll move across on the map to the other happenings. So we'll start out in Belarus, move across to Belarus at least. So Ukraine has started construction of a fence near the border at Belarus. So far it's spanning along Ukraine's Rivne and Zhytomyr oblasts. So here we go, Zhytomyr and Rivne. Also note, border guards at Belarus have accused Ukraine of planting mines at the border between the 2 countries on the Ukrainian side. Okay, and Ukraine is well within their rights to do so, especially with the Belarusian military build-up. Oh, and on the map, we'll move across to the Russian Oblast of Belgorod, where Russian forces are preparing defensive strategies again along the border here to Ukraine, and guess how they're doing it? again with those cheap concrete dragon's teeth cones that aren't even installed correctly. They're meant to be dug into the ground, not just plopped on top, so good luck with that. Then we'll move across quickly to the Donbass region as well. So take, for example, where the heaviest fighting still remains at Bakhmut. So particularly around the south area of Bakhmut, Ivanrad. If I can move there. Now, it's potentially likely that this settlement has fallen to the Russian forces, but we don't have any real confirmations on either side of that yet. So we'll see what happens shortly over the next day. Then we'll move across to Crimea, now Sevastopol. This isn't exactly battle related per se, but a photo of someone in Russian occupied Crimean Sevastopol right there celebrating secretly the liberation of Kherson. So good for them. Then we'll move across to around the port area of Odessa. So a Ukrainian SA-3 Goa has reportedly been repurposed as an anti-ship weapon on the Black Sea coast. These are actually Soviet-era surface-to-air missile systems normally, yet this one has been updated to point at the very limited number of Russian warships in the Black Sea. And I say limited just because Turkey has not been opening its Black Sea ports to allow any further additional Russian warships into the Black Sea. So good on you, Turkey. Although, to be fair, Turkey is following some international laws there at the moment. And then moving on to some news for the day. So 45 Ukrainian military personnel were released in a new prisoner swap deal. So it's always great to see Ukrainians coming back home. Then in some other news, in Ukrainian President Zelensky's last nightly address, he said, and I quote, "Today is a historic day. We are recapturing the south of our country, recapturing Kherson. The people of Kherson were waiting. They never gave up on Ukraine." And even French President Macron got into some of the action here as well, saying, quote, "I welcome Kherson's return to Ukraine. This is a critical step towards the restoration of its sovereign rights. France will stand beside the Ukrainian people." Merci beaucoup to our friend Macron. And then in some other news, Alexander Dugin, so a Russian ultra-nationalist and Putin's probably closest ally in this war, also known as Putin's brain regarding this war. So Dugin has been absolutely furious at the loss of Kherson in the last couple of days. So he's gone ahead and posted on Telegram, social media today, a cryptic story that was believed to be a threat against Putin's life. He shortly thereafter removed the quote, but it was too late. I mean, after all, this is the internet. Many people already screenshotted it. So the story was about a king that was killed due to not being able to provide for his people. Specifically, it was about not being able to provide during a drought, or provide the rain during a drought. So I'm not even kidding, I guess, when I say this, but this guy might only have a month to live, because Putin's Russia has a way of making people accidentally fall out of windows. And then in some other news, and potentially part of a wider news segment now, just because of the changing collective consciousness of the Russians. So basically, it's all about the changing tide of Russian feelings towards the Russian government due to Russia's horrendous foreign policy attacking a neighboring nation. So we have a video here for which I can only provide the screenshots because of the otherwise violent nature of it. So we have a Russian woman protesting in Russia against the withdrawal from Kherson. She cuts her arm and says the blood of Russian people is on Putin, Shoigu, and Surovikin, basically the political elite in Russia that are causing Russian troops to be cannon fodder, essentially. And then moving across, lastly, just a bit of a quick funny again today. So I'm not sure if you've seen this guy before, Vladimir Solovyov. He's basically the most popular pro-Russian government talk show host within Russia. And in this video, he starts to get very, very angry and vent about the loss of Kherson as well. So he says everybody was lying in Russia about how great the war was going. He's basically saying he and others were fooled by their very own Russian propaganda. He talks about the poor quality of the military in Russia. Now, I suppose, apparently, I guess, nobody in Russia realized that the Russian oligarchs were just cashing in those military contract checks for themselves and not actually providing any modern military equipment, or in many cases providing any equipment at all, just ticking off a list of something that didn't exist, and instead spending all of that extra cash that's now theirs on their very well-known Russian super yachts. And this host is pretty upset with all of this that's been going on, basically. See, propaganda could potentially be a powerful tool, but it also has the nasty effect of enslaving its own nation. That is to say, having them believe their own nation's BS or lies, such as the lie of having the best and most technologically advanced army in the world, which many Russians believed, which is an absolute horrible mistake to make. Always overestimate your opponent in war. And, I mean, take the US for instance, spending a verifiably accounted for $800 billion per annum for their military budget. They don't spend that money on nothing, that's for sure. So thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button. Again, thanks for all of your support in this. It's not the quickest process, not as quick as it looks, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.